Hello, class, and welcome as we conclude this chapter on the Vietnam War years. Please title your notes for today, Peace with Honor and Defeat. So, to begin, we're going to take a look at the election of 1968 and the dramatic exit of LBJ from political life. So, in March of 1968, it's an election year. LBJ goes on national television announcing that the US would be reducing its bombing of North Vietnam and ultimately start negotiating peace, which was positive for a lot of people among the US public. But then he also announced that he would not be seeking re election, which was a dramatic turn of events. It sent political shockwaves throughout the country because an incumbent is an extremely powerful force. They are a name that's recognizable. LBJ came into office following the assassination of John Kennedy. So he also had a lot of momentum and appeal in that way as well. So him exiting really provided a door for a conservative, for a Republican to walk through. So you might be wondering who kind of fills this role on the Democratic side. And initially, it's looking like it might be JFK's brother, Bobby Kennedy, but ultimately, Robert Kennedy is also assassinated. In 1964, Kennedy became a senator from New York. And then ultimately, he wins the California primary during the election of 1968, and then ultimately is killed before he's actually able to get the nomination from his party. In the photographs you can see on this slide, in the middle, he is claiming victory during the primary. And then the photo to the right is backstage after he was fatally shot. So after he's ultimately killed, we end up with Hubert Humphrey ultimately taking the Democratic nomination and running against Richard Nixon. While all of this is happening, the United States is largely unraveling in 1968, one of the most tumultuous years in all of American history. The civil rights movement has been going on for several years. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. The Vietnam War is still going on. The public experiences the Tet Offensive. The credibility gap is growing between the public and the government. And Johnson now is dropping out of the election. Culturally, there's a lot of generational unrest. The counterculture and hippies and all of these new trends are taking over the country. So it puts the public in a very tumultuous, precarious place. Now enter Richard Nixon, a familiar face, a conservative that kind of rivals the liberal spirit of Hubert Humphrey, and then ultimately takes the presidency in 1968. You can see, even though the popular vote is fairly close, it's 301 to 191 for the Electoral College. And what the election of 1968 really demonstrates is that a lot of Americans had enough with the protests and the violence and the permissiveness and the counterculture, the drugs, the new hairstyles, clothing, the expansion of the federal government and federal intervention in people's daily lives. And this is going to be kind of like the start of a conservative wave in the United States. Like you'll see, we're really going to have a lot of conservative presidents, with the exception of Jimmy Carter, back to back to back. So now let's start talking about the withdrawal of the United States. So again, Nixon is elected in 1968. We'll cover his administration, presidency, and foreign affairs outside of Vietnam in our next chapter. But now we're just going to talk about him in the context of the Vietnam War. So Nixon begins a process known as Vietnamization, which really is about exiting Vietnam without also humiliating the United States. For Richard Nixon, he was particularly concerned that he would be the first president to oversee a war where the United States lost. Things were obviously not looking great for the US in terms of reaching their goals at the end of the conflict. So he called his strategy peace with honor, like achieving peace while still maintaining the integrity of the United States, exiting gradually, and then turning over control to the South Vietnamese, who would ultimately continue to fight for themselves. But it's a very slow process, and because it's so slow, it's not enormously popular. And you can see in these images here the public perception of Vietnamization. So the straw man's argument is essentially when you set somebody up to ultimately be torn down. So like when you're writing an essay, the straw man fallacy is that you're creating something that makes someone look bad or makes the argument look bad only for you to then tear it down. In the case here, the United States is creating a military straw men through through Vietnamization that's being torn apart or plucked apart by Black Crows. And on the left, you can see the strategy for de escalating US involvement in Vietnam. So a lot of students don't learn about this portion of the war. They kind of go from like Vietnamization to kind of like the end of the conflict, but it's much more complex than that. There was a stalemate in the negotiations between the US and the North Vietnamese. And Nixon decides that he's going to launch a campaign to invade and bomb North Vietnamese bases in Cambodia to basically force their hand in the negotiations. And it's actually successful in some ways. It's very forceful. The end of it, the Christmas bombing, is probably the most intense period. I'll show you some pictures in just a moment. What's also interesting, though, is Nixon hid the intensity of this campaign from the American public, which you'll see only just furthers the credibility gap. As the Cambodia campaign is underway, anti war protests reemerge in the country. So a lot of Americans are concerned about getting now further embroiled in Cambodia as well as Vietnam, and millions take to the streets to protest, particularly on college campuses. At Kent State, 4 college students are killed, and 9 other are injured by National Guardsmen. This famous photograph over here to the right with this 14-year-old girl kneeling next to someone who had been slain by these bullets catches national attention as well, and just furthers the angry feeling among a lot of Americans toward the war. And this is exacerbated even further in the My Lai massacre, and most notably in the case that comes as a result of it. William Calley was charged with overseeing the massacre of 300 South Vietnamese citizens. Again, this grabs national attention. Basically, in these search and destroy missions, people believed that American soldiers were executing civilians, which you can see in this photograph over here to the left. This is a family before ultimately being killed. And this case grabs national attention. He's found guilty. And by 1971, 2/3 of Americans favor a quick exit from Vietnam. And you can see in this photograph here, which is pretty graphic, the My Lai massacre in full detail. To further this divide between the government and the US people, the Pentagon Papers are leaked by the New York Times, publishing secret reports that were prepared by the Department of Defense for President Johnson. And it's leaked by a man named Daniel Ellsberg, who was actually very pro war toward the beginning of the Vietnam conflict, and then changed his attitude when he felt like the conflict had become unwinnable. And they're very slowly leaked, daily and weekly, revealing that the government had been lying about military progress in Vietnam, as well as the motives for U.S. involvement in the region in the first place. So the Nixon administration tries to stop these reports from leaking. They actually put a court order ban on them being published. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules the Times and the Washington Post are protected by the First Amendment, free speech, and they're able to continue, releasing the reports. And you can see here Daniel Ellsberg speaking in front of Congress, commenting on the report that he was leaking as a whistleblower. So, as part of the Cambodia invasion and campaign, it concludes with the Christmas bombings of 1971, the heaviest and most destructive air raids in the entire Vietnam War, that yields a lot of civilian casualties among the North Vietnamese. And as horrifying as this was, and how alarmed this made the public of the entire world, it does get the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table, and they start to iron out an actual compromise. And this is what leads us to the Paris Peace Accords. So a ceasefire is declared at the end of the conflict, and the North Vietnamese relent on their desire to have one unified government in Vietnam. They say that the South Vietnamese regime can stay in place as long as their soldiers can stay there. The Nixon administration agrees, and that marks like the ceasefire of the conflict. One quick thing that's important to note is the War Powers Resolution, or the War Powers Act of 1973, that's triggered by a few different things. The wave of anti war protests, the violence that emerges in Brinkley and Kent State, the invasion of Cambodia, the Pentagon Papers. And what you want to know about the War Powers Act is it limits the president's ability to initiate or escalate a military action abroad. So many in Congress felt like LBJ had the Tonkin Gulf resolutions to basically do as he wished throughout the war. And that was one of the reasons why the war became so deadly. So the War Powers Act forces the president to get congressional approval before moving forward with warfare overseas. We're going to cover this much more in our next chapter, but while all of this is unfolding, President Nixon is forced to resign his office due to a scandal known as the Watergate scandal. And his vice president at the time, Gerald Ford, becomes the first non elected president of the country. We'll talk about Gerald Ford becoming the vice president after Richard Nixon's former vice president was forced to resign as well. But it's an interesting moment for the country with kind of this outsider who very few people knew taking over as the leader of the country, especially in a moment when faith in the government was so low. But again, we'll talk about Ford in the next chapter. For today, I just want to highlight the end of the war and the fall of Saigon. So in 1974, fighting restarts between South Vietnam and North Vietnam, and the U.S. at this point is unwilling to get involved again. Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital, is overthrown, and the U.S. embassy is overthrown as well as officials and South Vietnamese allies flee in chaos out of the embassy roof. You can see that pictured over there to the left. And by 1975, Vietnam had entirely fallen to communism. In this image here, you can see this is a victory parade of the North Vietnamese holding signs, pictures of Ho Chi Minh, and celebrating the entire collapse of the South Vietnamese government. So the legacy of Vietnam is a difficult one to tackle because people have very intense feelings about Vietnam. So many lives were lost, so much money was spent, $150 billion, 58,000 U.S. lives lost, 3 million Vietnamese deaths, casualties, civilians, military. And is considered by many to be the first U.S. military defeat in its entire history. The consequences of the Vietnam War are far reaching. It makes the United States think twice about getting involved in foreign conflicts, even to this day, but also signifies a shift politically in the country as well. Our next chapter is the conservative tide, and the Vietnam War breeds a counterculture, an entire generation of teenagers and kids who go against the norm and kind of like forge an identity for themselves. It creates a lot of protesting, rioting, unrest. It's happening in conjunction with the civil rights movement. And you'll see that many people clamor for a much more 1950s conformist life. And we'll see that in some ways in the late 1970s and early 1980s.